I call the April 4th, 2019 Board of Directors meeting to order. Please join me in saying the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Great. Welcome. We have Leslie Harbaugh on the phone with us tonight, and Lori Glover is in the air and won't be joining us tonight, but she's had a chance to look over all of this and have input. So we'll start. Are there any changes to the agenda? Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
I move.
Oh, go ahead.
You guys are going to be
I
fighting.
move approval of the agenda.
Is there a second?
Second.
Great. It has been moved by Marcia and seconded by David to approve the agenda. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? The motion has been approved. Come on in.
These are for speakers.
You're definitely welcome to join us.
Yes.
Oh, no, like, no.
You don't have to stay if you're,
I didn't know. Oh, gosh, this is awkward. Okay, well, you guys have a
That's
great meeting.
my bad.
Thank you
see
for
you next
coming.
week.
Zipporah tried to join us, Leslie, if that's what you're trying to figure out what's going on. Okay, we'll move on to 4.1 Policy 7325, Consultants, second reading and adoption. Is there a motion to adopt Policy 7325, Consultants?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Is there any discussion prior to the vote? Okay, with that, it has been moved by David and seconded by Marcia to adopt Policy 7325, Consultants. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? The motion has been approved. We'll move on for information piece, Procedure 650P, Construction Projects Change Orders.
A quick comment. After the last meeting, we made two adjustments in the procedure. One was to remove that very last sentence under purchase orders and referring to small projects. It was just confusing and wasn't necessary because really the entire structure for that was the structure for how to approve change orders on major capital construction. So we removed that last sentence. Also, in the sequence for major capital construction, there were three levels of approval. The first level was under $100,000. The superintendent may sign and approve. The second level referred to the superintendent and the board president could sign and approve, but it had the word interim approval. And that was called to my attention, and really, we didn't want an interim approval. If we signed that, it was an approval to move ahead. So I remind the board that all change orders will come to the board for information in aggregate, but that word interim was approved. So there is an approval level between $100,000 and $250,000 that is beyond the superintendent's authority to sign on his or her own, but with the support of the board president can be approved in that middle range. If it's $250,000 or above $250,000, I should say, then it must come to the board, even if we have to have a special meeting to approve that. So those are basically the two changes. One is the removal of that last sentence, quote unquote, paragraph, and secondly was the removal of the word interim from that stage between 100 and 250,000.
Can I ask
Yep,
a question?
Marcia.
Dr. Jarvis, just to clarify, because I read this policy about 6 times, and then any change orders over 100,000 and above will come to the board for approval, even if they're approved by the board president between meetings. Is that correct?
Not quite. All change orders, whether they're a change order for 7,000 or 170,000, will come to the board, and so the board at the next meeting will have all the change orders brought to them. The only ones the board will be asked for approval will be those that are above 250,000. So all of those, if the superintendent approves a change order for $75,000. That change order becomes effective. That's authorized by the district, and they move ahead. So the intent of that, of course, is to prevent any delays in the projects and be able to enable the project to move on. But then in that, we created that zone between 100,000 and 250 that says in addition to the superintendent, there would be the board president. That would be an approval on behalf of the district, but it would be brought to the very next board meeting for the board's awareness that it had been approved by the board president and the superintendent.
Okay, we can discuss that later, but yeah. And I would suggest just looking down the road as we let bids, and these are going to be fairly large projects, that we may want to modify this again as we get down the road in terms of the limits being on the low side.
I'm hoping that once we get through that first, I'm going to say 6 months, you can quiz Jeff on this, but once we get through the first 6 months of the contracts, you will have generally avoided those very large change orders that come as a result of some major change in design. So famous last words, I don't think you'll see as many of the large ones towards the latter stage, but I guess Mr. Green will prove us correct.
The procedure was presented to us tonight for information only. Is Leslie or anyone else, any other discussion on this procedure before we move on?
Wait a minute, so we're not,
No.
there's no,
We
we
don't
don't need a
approve. We
vote on
don't
this.
approve.
Will be
There's no
in
approval.
effect.
Okay, cool.
It's a procedure.
Good,
Yep.
good.
And sorry, Leslie, was there anything? Sorry.
No, I'm good, thank
Okay,
you.
great, thank you. Okay, we will then move on to 5.1, the tentative bargaining agreement between Peninsula School District and the public school employees of Peninsula Clerical Unit.
I recommend ratification of the tentative agreement, and we, of course, celebrate with our partners in achieving a new contract.
Great, thank you, and thank you. Is there a motion to approve the tentative bargaining agreement between Peninsula School District and the public school employees of Peninsula Clerical Unit?
So moved.
Second.
Okay. Is there any discussion before we vote? Okay. It has been moved by Marcia and seconded by David to approve the tentative bargaining agreement between Peninsula School District and the public school employees of Peninsula Clerical Unit. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
Aye.
The motion has been approved. Thank you. Sorry about that, Leslie. Okay, we will then move on to the consent agenda. Is there any discussion on the consent agenda prior to the vote? Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thanks, Marcia.
I was going to give Leslie a chance.
I was too. I was like, Leslie?
Okay, so Leslie, they're gonna let you chime in if you want on motions. Okay, it has been moved by David and seconded by Marcia. Oh, did you have discussion, Leslie?
No, I think there's just a delay when I'm
Gotcha.
responding to you, that's all.
Okay, well, we'll wait longer even.
She didn't vote no then.
Well, we haven't voted yet.
No, on the
Okay,
contract.
okay,
That
right.
was her delay.
Is there, it's been moved by David and seconded by Marcia to approve the consent agenda. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? The motion has been approved. We'll then go into study session, and first up is for capital projects.
Again, I thank the board for the special board meeting we added in March, April, and May, and this is that second one of those three. It allows us to get some of the work done that's moving at a very rapid pace. Last meeting, you approved architects and consultant contracts. The next meeting, you will get the regular monthly report by our project management firm, Green Gasaway, and Mr. Green. But this particular study session, we scheduled an opportunity for our project management to outline for the board take a look at the entire project from somewhat top to bottom in the timeline and what's ahead, so that the board would have a good sense of what's ahead of you as we approach 4 construction projects. And so I would reintroduce Mr. Jeff Green and his colleagues, and I think Patrick Gillespie, our facilities director, will also be there. And they will try to keep you informed ahead of time on what's ahead.
I read it at home and I forgot to put it back in my bag. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jarvis. And it's great to be here, members of the board. So thank you. So I'm still suffering a little bit of a cough, and so if I start coughing, Jesse will take over, and I'll excuse myself for a moment. So it's a great pleasure to be here this evening, and what we wanted to do is kind of go through some of the steps, the mandatory steps the board has to take as part of the construction, and also some of the other steps that will occur. So we'll kind of walk through the whole design construction process with you, and then we'll show you a roll-up of a CPM schedule. So a lot of these activities are linked in time, and they have durations, and when you connect the dots, you end up with what's called a CPM, critical path method. But there's a lot of detail that goes into the schedule that isn't really relevant to you, and so we won't spend very much time. We're just going to show you a simplified schedule. So a huge amount of progress has been made already, and a lot of the critical issues the district has grappled with in a very efficient manner. So there's been reporting protocols established. There's been oversight protocols established. We have to remember the district really hasn't done major construction for more than a decade. So a lot of the things that other districts that build on a regular basis have kind of a history and a culture of doing, Peninsula doesn't have, and has to establish protocols for our district, for this district. We have some of the startup protocols. Not only are the board reporting protocols and how we report to the board, but we also have to establish kind of guidelines for how the educational facilities are to be developed. Those are called educational specifications. We have to create documents that kind of guide the kinds of materials that we want to use and how they get put together. Those are called design and material standards. So Patrick will be the lead in developing design and material standards. We have a consultant to walk us through the EdSpec creation, and then that gets rolled out to each of the schools to do their own modifications or adjustments to it. So all that's kind of behind the scenes, but it requires a huge amount of work to get it all set up, and to get it all set up in a way that's both within our budget and within our schedule. And so we have a schedule created. It's a very aggressive schedule to produce the facilities as fast as we can, which we will get to kind of at the end. But this is really a chance for us to kind of go through each of the steps with you, and for you to ask questions about what's that step, or is that the way it's always done? What other options are there?
Mr. Green, I'm going to interrupt for just a second. I think to emphasize that point, we've set this up really to allow questions as they occur to you, not to wait for some part of the end of the program. So I would certainly encourage you, whatever the issue, whenever it comes to mind, to signal that you have a question, and we'll try to collectively or individually answer that, or get back to you with an answer. So it's really set up to be as open as you would have it, to learn what you need to learn.
Leslie, can you hear Jeff okay?
I can, but I'm not sure what we're supposed to be looking at.
We haven't shown you anything yet.
Do you have your capital facilities bond book with you?
I do yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, we're not looking at anything yet.
Then-
And if you have a question, just speak up because I can't see a signal. So,
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I do have a question, though. You mentioned an EdSpec consultant. Will those people be working for you or for the district?
They work for the district.
And have we identified?
Integris will be doing that.
Oh, that's right.
And
Thank you.
again, that involves a lot of people at the district, spring break, other constraints to get those meetings set, and those meetings are set for the last half of April. So we expect a final readout on the district standard ed spec on May 6th, is what our schedule is. We're celebrating today because we completed 3 hours of meetings with our first architectural team that covered 2 of our facilities, so that you can look at that as a kickoff with our architects. So very collaborative. It was TCF Architecture, and it was Elementary 10 and Evergreen. So we've kind of gone over the parameters from the district's point of view of what we're expecting from them, and they've had a chance then to talk with us and all of the questions they have. Jesse's basically worked with your attorney to complete a contract that we'll be sending to them for their review, and that'll be submitted so you can see the form of the contract at your next meeting. We're soliciting proposals which will be incorporated by purchase orders into that contract. So, and they often have comments on the contract, so what you'll see probably isn't the very final version, but it's close to the final version.
Jeff, without having ed specs set, what are the architects doing at this point?
Well, one is you've approved a very large number of specialty consultants. So we have the sites being surveyed, we have geotech studies being done, we have, there's about 6 consultants at each site that are preparing studies that the architects need to get moving. The architects, we have given them budgets and mock ed specs. So we said this is generally what we want. So it's not refined the way the district would want it, but it's the right area, and it has the right characteristics that meet or exceed the promises made to the public. So the ed spec eventually will be close to that, but it'll be actually district generated.
And Jeff, we've also tasked the architects with, they're already looking at permitting timelines and how they're going to be able to get U permits. So we've already got meetings scheduled with the city. So those are some of the things that the architect's helping with immediately.
So we
To
have,
keep them busy for a while.
we have, they're called pre-app meetings with City of Gig Harbor on both Elementary 9 and Elementary 10. And I think we filed today for pre-app meetings with the county for Ardendale and for Evergreen. And that'll give us a better understanding of the timelines or the steps that the county or city wants us to go through and exactly how we can match up to that timeline. But we will also be shortly basically trying to get set up meetings, site-based meetings, so that we can start engaging both staff and community at the schools that we're going to be replacing. So we had put the first, if you can turn to the first graphic, I think we'll just walk through this graphic. So can that get put up on the board so the audience can see it as well?
Oh, Leslie, it's
Leslie,
number
yeah.
2.
Leslie, under school board participants, there's the first kind of bar graphy.
It's the colorful, the only really colorful document. It's titled School Board Participation. Do you have a thumb drive? Does it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, maybe we'll just go old school.
Let's give him a sec, see, maybe Dan can get into it.
Leslie, we're trying to get it up on the screen.
You may have to walk it through. If there's pictures of my kids in there somewhere, just ignore those. We'll eventually find the right document.
Like notes all over it. It's okay.
Project.
Yeah, should we just start and then? Yeah, why don't you go ahead and proceed and then when and if it gets up, we'll.
Okay, so this is what the document looks like. So the left-hand side of the document, the colorful side of the document, is the design side of the document. And the right-hand side of the document that doesn't have color on it, it's titled For SCAP-Funded Projects. So SCAP is the state term for state funding. So 2 of our projects will receive some state funding. And to receive the funds,
I'm sorry, we're looking at the long document?
No, it's the first.
Tab number 2.
First one, right, is school board participants, or tab 2. It's a one-sheeter, it's actually 2 sheets. The left side has colored bars, and the right side has a list of
Oh, I see, thank you.
SCAP, yep.
It's like a Christmas tree.
so 2 of the projects receive state funds, and the state funds are granted through a process called the D process. That's because we've gone through the A process, the B process, and the C process. Eventually, we'll get to the E process and F process, maybe. And they're laid out roughly in time sequence. So as you drop down the page, the further down the page you go, the further forward in time you go. So on the pre-design, the blue section, that's work already done. So that's the authorization of the bond. And a lot of the pre-design consulting contracts have already been approved by the board. So those are these studies that are required by the architect to get them going. And so if there's questions about that, so that's pre-design. So we may do some work with the architects under a pre-design purchase order that falls under their contract that allows us to get started. What's important is that we get communication with our sites sufficiently quickly so that we get communication before people leave for the summer. So we're under a real time constraint to make sure that our architects have time to get out and meet with the staff and communities at Evergreen and Ardendale.
It's a typical turnaround. We do all the odd numbers, and the state does all the even numbers, correct?
We do the odd numbers, and
Right.
the state does the even numbers.
So is there a typical turnaround? The further we get down, is there longer turnarounds between the state to get back to us, or is it in the beginning the turnaround times are longer? If that makes sense.
Yes, so the answer is that the D7 and the D9 are both related to the bid. And so they occur relatively close together. They're also by far and away the biggest submittals. So they're huge packages of information and require a lot of effort to assemble all the information. So they occur close in time, they're big packages, and they're rigid. So if we can't do one step until we get the other step. So we can't open bids till we have a D8. So we can't file the D7 until we've submitted for permits. We can't open bids until we get a D8. We can't sign the contract until we get a D10. So you'll see your project managers having a certain amount of tension in that window of time because a lot of paperwork has to be done perfectly. We have to get the documents if we do it wrong. it gets messed up. We've filed for the D1, which is the study and survey. No real time limit on when you do that. You just have to do a D1 before you can do a D3. Nobody really cares when you file a D3, so no real time constraints on that, except you can't file a D3 until they accept your D1. So we need back from them basically a D2 saying that, or we need back acceptance of our submittal before we can file the D3. We will file the D3 as soon as we get into schematic design this summer. So we'll file it sometime in the summer. The D5, we can't file the D5 until we get through SEPA, and we will file it as soon as we get a DNS on our SEPA. So that will probably be sometime in September. There's a 60-day window after you file the D5 before they issue a D6. So that's the only real time window. And then the time between the D9 and the D11 is you don't file the D11 until the project's done. And so there could be 2 years between the D9 and D11. So there's a lot of little resolutions. We tried to outline the resolutions associated with each of those. Sometimes you wonder why the resolution's worded the way it is. It's not the most gracefully worded sometimes. But we basically take it out of the state manual and write it exactly the way the state manual says they want it written. Sometimes we're not sure why, because some of them seem somewhat redundant to us, but it's what the state manual says, and so we just follow the state manual.
Stupid question.
There's no stupid
I know
question,
you-
because if I don't know the
I know
answer,
you're going to answer that. I know you're going to say it, but I'm going to say it anyway.
I mean, you're setting me up for a big failure, so.
No, I mean, it's going to just show that my ignorance on all this. It's just, until we get the D11 to D11, are we able to do anything on the property for D9? Can we start clearing it when we get permits, or do we have to wait till D11?
Yeah, so what happens is, we open the bids, we meet with the contractor, we file the D9. So that might be 3 days. And usually within 2 or 3 days, the state gives us back a D10. So the resolution that we ask on the bid award will be odd to you, because what it'll actually say is that you recommend award of the bid and authorize the superintendent to execute the contract upon receipt of appropriate documentation. And that's because we can't sign the contract until we get the D10. You can't actually award the contract on a state-funded project until you have permission to award the contract. So what you're doing is granting the superintendent permission to execute the documents.
Okay.
Are you asking that because of Site 9 or 10?
I was just asking for Site 9 so that, from a community perspective, whenever they start to see something happening on that piece of property, we're looking at 60-day turnaround between D5 and D6, and then we still have to go through 7, 8, 9, 10. So that's going to be 60 days. So that'd be November sometime before we get to the D6. And so my question is, do you think it's conceivable that they could start clearing the property this year?
2 things. So one is sites 9 and 10 aren't deprocessed schools.
Because there's no
Well,
state
that answered
funding.
that.
Yeah, I was going to say
So
that.
once we have
Why would
permits,
we do that?
we can start working as soon as we have permits on
Yeah,
Site 9.
just our existing.
And
Okay.
And the state has a process for allowing early projects. So we have to file a letter with the state asking for permission to do an early project and have it incorporated into the process. And so that's the exception to the D process. We can get a letter that allows us to incorporate an early site project.
Follow up on this, because we're not going to go through the D process on the new schools. There's some provisions in the upcoming budgets and in legislative language to increase the allocation of square footage, and also the funding level per square foot. Thank goodness, it's been a long time. You still don't believe that our new schools will be eligible for state funding, even with increased state square footage?
Somebody would have to give me the regulations so we can calculate our probability.
It's not passed yet.
Right, so normally we will follow that in
Right.
the history of the bill and if it looks like it's going to pass. So our plan is to use the same process on all 4 schools, even though there's certain activities that we don't have to do under state law. But we wouldn't pass D motions on those projects unless the proposed law says that if you follow the D and pass the D resolutions, then you would be eligible. So we would do anything to maximize the district's eligibility
Right.
as the laws come through this spring, I guess, in the spring session. So what I'd like to do is go through the left-hand side, which is the green activities are the design activities. The red activities are permitting activities. The yellow activity, well, great, we have it up, but nobody can read at least. So you might want to zoom in on the design section there. So keep bringing us forward. One more time. Okay, can people read that? Where it says,
It's better.
so the first green bar says design. And under that, it says district approving consultants and district approving consultant contracts. So that's kind of where we are. We've approved the architects. We're negotiating their contracts at the moment. And the contracts will come through probably in pieces. So you'll probably get a startup contract that says they'll do limited services for a certain amount. And then probably on the 25th, you'll actually get their full proposal. So you'll see all of the elements of their contract that they'll be governed through the duration of the project. And you'll see what the total amount of their contract is. So a pre-design activity is conceptual design. So it's not one of the steps of the AIA process, but it would allow us to get started with some design work in a lot of community and staff meetings. So what we've told the architects today is that we basically want to see options for site layouts and massing diagrams basically by the end of May. So that before our population, our students, our staff, and our community leaves for summer break, we're able to report back to you what we believe the best choices for developing each site. Generally what the building might be looking like or its massing, what elements would be included in that we could get your feedback. Because over the summer we're going to be doing the first step of first step of design, the schematic design. We're actually going to be hardlining the drawings and setting up the architectural models so that we can get to move on to our first phase of permitting. So under conceptual design, in the parentheses, site development, building massing, space summary, cost model estimate. So they'll do a layout and we'll ask them basically to come back and be sure that the building's no bigger than what we've told them it can be, that their estimator agrees with our cost modeling, that we're within budget, that we know which elements we intend, how we intend to develop the site, and how big and of what general shape the building is going to be. It's not required, but we generally ask the board to approve that conceptual design formally. So you don't have to, it doesn't mean anything, but it gives us assurance moving out over the summer that the board has seen the design and that you don't object to us proceeding with that design. And so in our little diagram, you'll see sometimes a parentheses at the end. So I say district resolution approving conceptual design, parentheses, not mandatory. So you don't have to approve it. We would, if you don't like it, we'd like you to reject it. You don't have to do that by motion. You can just tell us you don't like it.
So Dr. Jarvis, is that something that you intend the district to, look to the board to approve that?
Yes, and one of the reasons for that is that that's a stage that's, I'm going to say, easily changed if the board said we'd like this in a different place on the site. A couple months later, that's a very expensive change. So it really is one of just making sure that on those very large decisions that move ahead before we start detailing and spend literally hundreds and thousands of hours on the details, that there are things that you in fact know where the building's going to be, how big the building might be on site. He refers to massing, and he can explain that better than I can, but it's that looking at that earliest concept of, if it's here and it's this big, are you okay with that? And we've got two schools, obviously, where we're building on site next to the current buildings. We've got two that are, one that's already started, so the site is fixed at number 10, and then number 9 would be a classic of, there are options of where they could put the building and what that meant for example, if I may, and then they can explain. They can place the building in different places depending on what you want. Do you want to have a building that's mostly seen or mostly not seen? And what would that mean to a community? What would it mean to a neighborhood? So those kind of things come to you early on for good reason. You don't have to do that, but if there were really something that you looked at and said, hey, that's probably not what we want, they need to know right then and go back and say, okay, glad we knew that before we went to the next step. So
Sort of the saving, it says it's not mandatory, sort of like, doesn't matter if we like it or not, you're moving forward.
we're bringing it to you and giving you a chance to say we don't like it.
So it's relatively easy and inexpensive at that point to go back and do other studies. And we'd probably ask for special board meetings to actually work through any issues where we felt we had disagreement on the design, or if you needed more information. But when we get into schematic design, so we may be working through much of June and July and the first part of August intently on hardlining these. Then it gets to be relatively big dollar numbers to move the building around or change things. So we would rather spend a month in June with special meetings working with you to come up with what you felt was the best appropriate solution, rather than have you say, not sure, and let us move forward, where now it is a big time impact to me and a big dollar cost to the district. So
Jeff, so the board knows what to expect. Are you charging the architects to come up with every possibility that could happen on a piece of property, and then coming to you saying, here's our recommendation based off of this, this, this? Will we see all those options, or are we just going to see the ultimate recommendation by the architects? Or you?
You will see the recommendation of the architect.
Of one solution.
one
So we won't
solution.
know or understand potential pitfalls of the other ones, or?
Well, we believe the district has selected superb architects that are very knowledgeable on educational facilities. They will be meeting on the 2 sites where we have staff with the staff and community. And the staff and community will be providing advice and comment. A lot of the issues we think will be sorted out in that process. And then our office will be doing our also internal review of the documents and challenging all of the decisions to make sure that we believe that the buildings can be built in the budget and in the time. So we will have the EdSpec complete by May 6th. So when we come to you with these design solutions, they'll be consistent with the district's EdSpec. And we think we'll be able to demonstrate that they're consistent with the ed spec, and we believe if we're on area, we're going to be on budget. So we would only go back to alternates. We probably wouldn't go back to alternates because we would bring to you what we felt is the best solution that met all of the district's criteria. If you didn't like the options presented, then we would want to know what you didn't like, and we'd probably actually create a new option for you rather than one of the other options. So in most cases, a lot of the options get flawed, and the flaw becomes evident. So
That's great. I wasn't asking for one way
Yeah.
or the other. I just wanted to know what to expect. We're going to see the best proposal put in front of us, and that's,
exactly,
okay.
yes.
Excellent.
So upon approval, so now we're done kind of, we're end of May, early June. We're done with conceptual design. We have a plan as to what we're going to execute. And we'll go through the schematic design, same elements, a site development, building elevations now, not just massing, but actual elevations, floor plans, and cost estimates. So the cost estimates may still be models. And this will basically take up most of June, July, and at least probably the first half of August. But now we actually will have a building. We won't just have blocks and spaces and stuff like this. We'll have a building. And we plan to ask for your approval of the schematic design. Partly because,
Jeff, can I just interrupt you for a moment, just so I understand? You're just talking School 10 schedule right now, right?
now I'm talking
No.
4 projects,
All 4?
all 4.
Okay.
We don't, oh yeah.
No, okay,
You'll have to talk to
No.
Art about this, but he told us,
okay, no. Continue, sorry, I just needed to get clarification on that.
they do separate slightly further down the line.
It's true.
So
Got those scissors out, didn't you?
in August, we'll be filing basically our land use permits, and we've hired a specialty consultant to assist with this filing. But a lot of these buildings come in under design guidelines. And so to get into the land use process permitting, we actually have to produce elevations that are colored, have materials and colors on them to get into the design review committees. And so we generally like your approval of schematic design, but it may actually be the design submittal that we bring to you that has the colors and materials shown, so that we can get your input on actually what we're filing to get a permit to do. So in certain jurisdictions, it's difficult to change the color after you have approval. And I think that's true of City of Gig Harbor. I'm less certain about the county, exactly what we have on the county. But before we make that submittal, we want you to know what we're recommending the buildings look like and to have your approval. It also seems like it's a good time to ask the architects to render what they're doing so that we actually can show the public. A lot of people have trouble reading architectural drawings, so my wife does for one. They're abstractions of reality, and a lot of people just don't relate because they're not drawn in perspective. But rendering is actually drawn in perspective. A lot more people can relate to it. And so what we'd want to do is get something out there so the public could actually see what it is we're intending to produce.
About what month is that again?
This is going to be late August, early September.
All right.
So it often takes several weeks to get a rendering done. So if we get the submittals ready and take it to you, it's your second board meeting in August, then it would be maybe middle of September before the rendering would be ready. So the district does their SEPA. So there'll be some documents prepared for SEPA and correspondence, letters sent out, in a process involved there, which I think your process doesn't actually require board action, but I'd have to review it. As soon as the SEPA is complete, we can file the D5. So the authorities having jurisdiction, which are City of Cape Harbor and Pierce County, they have land use regulations. Often there's public hearings involved. And we would be making those submittals to those authorities.
Jeff, can I interrupt for just a second? There are people watching this, it's actually being live streamed, who may not know what SEPA is. Would you?
State Environmental Protection Agency,
Thank you.
I think is what it stands for. I'm sorry. So those are the laws that govern as to whether we have a significantly adverse environmental impact.
Are you thinking that we have the policy on the books that we would be our own lead agency for SEPA?
Yes.
Good. That speeds it up.
So I believe we've already hired the consultant to walk us through the SEPA process.
Yes.
And SEPA actually is unique, I think. The SEPA term is a Washington term, so residents that have recently moved from California, I don't think they actually use the SEPA term in California. So it's a good question to ask, what does it mean? And probably if you're not in construction, you don't pay much attention to it. But we will be going through, concurrent with the SEPA process, we'll be going through the land use, design and land use approvals from the jurisdictions. So that's kind of the end of the schematic phase. So the land use permitting may take a significant amount of time. And one of the reasons we're filing the pre-app is so that we can actually talk to the jurisdictions and work out what the protocol is to make sure that we get through with as few hiccups as possible. But the jurisdictions have a lot of rules and regulations, and they have a wider public. So we only deal with the school-age public, really, and they deal with a wider public. And so their processes are their processes, and we conform. We generally have a very close relationship with the permitting agencies, and we try and conform to their process exactly. We just try and understand what their process is. So, are there any questions on schematic design? So if we roll down a little bit. So I combined, the next green bar says design development and contract documents. So the contract that we write with the architect says that they do design development, which is basically a lot more detail of their documents. And then they have a process where they give us design development documents and we get to review them. And then they start contract documents. We're compressing the schedule, so we won't have as formal a stop between design development and contract documents. We'll basically be working continuously in the fall, doing design development, and then roll continuously into contract documents to expedite it. Otherwise, there's about 30 to 40 days of review that gets stuck in the middle, and it pushes us beyond when we would like to be out to bid. So you read the contract, it talks about design development, but you actually won't see design development, and there's no submittals to the board at that point. When we finish contract documents, when we get close to finishing contract documents, we produce what's called the permit set document that has all the permit information but doesn't necessarily have all the details necessary to complete the work. And as soon as those documents are ready, they will be submitted to the authorities having jurisdiction. So those are both building permits and utility companies. So we basically are partnering with our authorities having jurisdiction and partnering with our utilities. They have to support what we're doing as well. As soon as we file with for our permits, we're generally successful in getting the supporting documentation to submit the D7, which is the request to the state to proceed with bid opening. So processes that I haven't talked about, we do a value analysis or a VE, value engineering report, and we'll do a constructability review. So these are consultant contracts will come to you. And at this point in time, which is at the point where we're basically submitting for permit, we'll be doing the constructability review, which is basically a group of professionals who will look at our documents to double check to make sure that they can't see any flaws in a contractor being able to produce the building from those documents. And we'll be wrapping up our contract documents. We will ask you for approval of the construction documents, which again, I don't think is a mandatory step. But we'll basically have at one of your meetings, we'll say, here's a contract documents. So a huge pile of documents and very interesting reading, a couple of books that go with it, and ask for your permission to bid that document. So I don't believe under your regulations it's mandatory for you to approve the documents, but it's a good step to tell you that we're ready to bid and we're going to go to bid. And at that point, you can question us in a lot more detail about whether we did the D7 and got the D8 and what's our plan for the D9.
Jeff, going back a little bit, in compressing the design, development, and contract documentation, you're cutting out that waiting period or period of time in between there on a non-art schedule. What are we giving up something in doing that? Are we creating extra risk?
There's, in a short time, if you actually read the contract, you can't compress it the way they have it written, because they're all sequential steps, and the contract specifies durations for all the steps. So what you do is you burden your project manager to be sharper and work longer nights to make sure they do the review, because the risk is the risk is that we don't fully understand what's in the documents. And so the risk is that they start working with something that the district would not want in the documents. But we think the process that we have set up, where we'd be meeting with the architects every other week, would preclude us from getting a situation where they would be off doing something that we wouldn't be aware of. So I think the biggest risks are whether the cost estimating is correct and whether we can attract the number of qualified bidders that we would like. And we don't think that risk is mitigated by taking a month to do a review. So we think those are significant risks, and we intend to mitigate them. So we've already had staff both researching every other district in the South Sound and when they intend to bid their projects, and every contractor who's bid a public school project in the last 5 years and what their bonding capacity is. So we're calling all the contractors. We've identified their bonding capacities. We're calling all the school districts, identifying their bid schedules. And we will be marketing to all of the contractors. First off, we'll try and make sure that our projects are scoped in a scope that has the widest contractor base that can perform. And then we'll be marketing to all of those contractors about what a great place this is to work. So, and we believe that. So we believe we'll have great contractor interest.
And we pay our bills on time.
And that's not to be,
That's a big deal.
Becoming less common these
right,
days.
that's
So
actually a huge plus.
really is a big plus, and contractors really do pay attention to that.
Absolutely.
So the risk that we're accepting by compressing the schedule is a risk that we don't think uncompressing the schedule makes any less risky, and we're addressing it proactively in other ways.
Thank you.
And here.
So the exciting thing is, now we get to the yellow bar.
Hasn't been exciting yet.
So this is hugely fun. And this is anywhere from November to March, depending on the leniency the superintendent gives us and how the permits fall out. So we're very aggressive on the schedule as we've laid out. And we're only beginning to investigate the permitting timelines and some of the constraints. What we wanted to be sure was that we had selected architects that were committed to this aggressive schedule. Because if you start late, you can't catch up. If you start on an early schedule, you can slide a little bit and still be successful. So we'll get to the CPM in a minute where we link these things together. But in the bid and award phase, it's kind of a ritualized phase, and it's a little bit different than some of the other phases of the work because you're interacting with a lot of people who may become your partners, your contractors. There's a ritualized way of them asking questions and us responding because equity, making sure that everybody has the same information at the same point in time is a really important thing. The receipt of bids is my favorite time, actually. So a lot of people are hugely anxious about it because you don't know until you open the envelope exactly what the number is going to be.
Sealed bids.
It's sealed bids. If somebody shows up a minute late, the bid's not opened. So there's all of these little things. Your parking lot will be filled with people madly writing as they talk on their cell phone. It's
Yeah, me too. Lots of times.
right. It's fun, I think.
Sounds fun.
Interesting.
Right. And so then you open the bids and then we have a meeting after we open the bids and decide what we're going to do about it all. But anyway, so you'll see it more rigid and we'll be less flexible in that point. Our communication is very stylized at that point to make sure that everybody feels that that it was fair and equitable.
Again, Jeff, just a clarification I'd have you make at this point in terms of the number of bids that you plan on opening at one time, i.e. how many projects are you bidding at the same time? Originally, you talked about all 4 projects proceeding on the timeline, so
Yes,
just
thank you.
clarification here. I realize it's the next section, but
So we plan to open the first bid in late November. And then we plan to open a bid in late January, in mid-February, and in the first half
For different
of March.
projects.
purple page,
So November, I'm assuming school 10.
it was further down the list.
No,
No?
no.
Okay.
Yes, school 10, I'm sorry, you're right.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Yes, so.
Scroll up from there.
So our thinking is that the projects will be designed to appeal to slightly different segments of the market. They won't be bid at the same time. We want enough time between each bid so that it can go to the board and a recommendation can be made so that before we open the next bid, contractors are aware if they have work or don't have work. So we want to keep the bidding pool as rich and excited as we can. So we don't want it to hang up where if we bid them too close together, people may be uncertain as to whether they're going to receive a bid award or not, and therefore be uncertain as to whether they should bid the next project.
So Jeff, I had them scroll to the next slide.
Jesse,
The project's laid out here, and we've got, these are condensed, we've got, the design and permit process that Jeff just walked me through, and we've got this bid and award line here, and so we've got, for example, ES10, we've got the bid and award window here, ES9, we've got the bid and award window, they're staggered. So that's what we've done with all 4 of the projects like Jeff just explained, and that kind of shows them visually how we're staggering them at this point.
Leslie, Jesse's having us refer to the kind of fold-out document now. And looking at the timeline on the
Thank you.
left-hand side.
well, Jesse spoiled the surprise. So.
She likes that.
Yeah, so when you open the bid, you have to prepare this documentation, submit it to the state, get their approval, get the D10 back before you can sign the contract. And so, again, it's a relatively ritualized process to make sure that we followed all of the steps in the right sequence. And sometimes we drive documents to Olympia. Sometimes we drive down and pick up documents to make sure. I'm uncomfortable signing or asking the superintendent to sign because somebody told me the D10's available. I actually want a D10 that I can touch. So then we start construction, and actually nothing happens during construction from a process point of view.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that takes us through the bid process. And so we have most of this year in design. You can think of, there's almost a year in design. The bid window is about 3.5 weeks, but they're staggered. So we'll be bidding November and then January, February, March in bidding. Construction will start a week or 2 after the bid award. And so one project will start construction. It may actually not physically start construction until after the end of the year holiday. But then the other projects will gear up in February, March, and April. When you talk about change orders, actually, when we look at cash flow peaks in the summer, particularly that first summer. And project risk actually peaks at earthwork. So the biggest exposure for change orders are actually the first summer in their earthwork exposures. So we have great geotechnical engineers, and we'll be doing studies to make sure that we understand exactly the soil types that we have to minimize the risk. But when you're digging underground, you come across things that you don't find even when you drill and test. So we think we'll have a good handle, but we'll be running twice the cash flow that first summer is what we will the subsequent 8 months. It'll peak the first summer and then the second summer in cash flow. And cash flow translates into tired workers and project managers. I mean, there's just a lot of activities. A lot of activities happen when it's relatively dry out. So during construction, you'll be getting our reports on a continuing basis. And you'll be getting change order documentation. And we'll be managing cash flow and risk and reporting to you on potential risk and potential exposure during the course of that. But there's no D form that we do during that process. There's no formal approval during that process. Then we go to occupancy. So we're planning occupancy. The first occupancy would occur in the summer of 20, if we can make that work. So, and then The second occupancy.
Sounds so good.
The second occupancy, we're planning actually for June of '21 because it involves a reboundary situation, and people get anxious if they can't see. There'd be a lot of chatter about reboundary because it really affects, it doesn't just affect that school, it affects a huge portion of the district. And so everybody will be curious, even if they're not attending that school. And then for the two projects that we're rebuilding the project, we intend to occupy in that same summer, whichever is summer '21, at some point. But after we occupy, we then have to tear the old building down and create new fields. And so in the schedule, if Jesse still has it up, if you roll it out, you'll see, oh, those projects didn't finish on time. They extend like into '22. And that's because we'll be tearing the building down and building the fields. And building the fields isn't completely resolved at the moment because, and we'll have to, this is where we need more information from our contractors, but if we can't get the fields done by a certain point in time, you have to grow the grass. And so that transition, exactly when the field opens, is a little bit uncertain. So it may actually be the following summer. We usually like to get 2 growing seasons in before the field opens. And that'll just have to be kind of worked out exactly what we can do on each of the sites. So we're not far enough along to be able to tell you exactly how that's going to phase. And then we go to the warranty period, which is only a year, and the closeout period, which may last several years. So we're looking at trying to expedite closeout. It's been a difficult part, I think, of the construction industry. So big picture, those are the steps. Big picture, that's the schedule. What makes it somewhat complicated is, little picture is, we may actually want to do a construction project this summer, and maybe more than one. And so we have to think about, on elementary 10, how we're actually going to occupy, and whether we need to do some kind of modification to the facility to occupy the way we intend to occupy, which may drive a small project this summer. On elementary 9, like you said, wouldn't it be fun to clear it and grade it and plant the field this summer? Like, that would be so cool. But jurisdictionally, probably not possible and probably not cost effective. So we do a lot of multi-phase projects, and we're pretty comfortable doing multi-phase projects. We think that properly done, they're less risky than starting a project in the winter. So most of our dirt around here is moisture sensitive, far cheaper to handle the dirt in between August 1st and the end of October than it is in the wintertime. But there are jurisdictional constraints on that, and we have to manage the risk of having a multi-phase project versus having a single-phase project. So that's part of what we're going to be surveying our contractors, is how do they want the project set up for them to be most successful. So we believe we can set our projects up so that the contractors can see themselves being successful building our schools on the schedules that we give them, and that therefore we'll get more competitive bids. So there may be reasons why we take the field out of the general contractor daily work and put the field as a separate contract. So we may have early projects, we may have late projects in the context of what we've discussed this evening. And each of those projects would generate requirements to come before you and approvals. So are there any further questions on that?
Not from me at this time. Leslie, do you have any questions?
No, I'm good. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Leslie. We haven't gone into the detail of the Gantt chart, partly because there aren't really issues you need to worry about. And whatever we show you in the Gantt chart would be wrong within a week because we're constantly rescheduling. It's a guide for what we're doing. It's quite extensive in its detail. It more or less guides us day to day. But it doesn't really provide clarity about what we believe our mission is. And you don't really need to know what we need to do to get a permit ready. You just need to know we got the permit ready.
Okay.
Obviously, the purpose of this evening was to both give the board and the community a relatively detailed look at what is ahead over these next 2 years. As Jeff says, the 2 years can actually stretch longer than that as you get into a warranty period and the completion. It is aggressive, but I want to go back for just a second in a sense of, as he was talking multi-phase versus a single. You could do a very clean project in which all the documents are done, and then it goes to bid, and there's only one contractor, and everything's on that. But you take the risk that you could get a significant delay if you can't start on time, and the mud is there, et cetera. So you then look at the alternative and say, if I were to start the phase 1 and do the dirt separately, I'm taking a certain risk because the next contractor can always say I didn't like that or I didn't like something about it. But all the way through really takes this very experienced project management firm to say this is how we're doing this is why, and on the advice of the surveyors, the advice of the land use, the advice of all of the consultants that are helping prepare. So when he talks about getting the permitting process, that if it were me doing a home project, I could go down and say, here's what I want to do, and then they tell me what's wrong with my application. I go back, and I come back in about 4 weeks or 6 weeks, and I repeat that about 7 times if I'm on my skill level. In terms of what we're talking about, there would be horrendous delays in the project and blow all of our time schedules, and really what do we do about the kids in the meantime? So this is amazingly sequenced, and I thank them for that. But we wanted to give you a look at that, how that sequence is driven, how it's driven out of things that make sense, how it moves from phase to phase. The staff and the citizens will be both involved as we start the ed specs, but then the ed spec process will move quickly. Then back when you heard me recommending, this was I think back in October, of why February instead of April as far as an election. You can see the difference that this gives us the opportunity to get things done between now and June that allows then the experts to do the design work and all the details during the summertime, which benefits us over and over and over. And so that's a long way of saying that really the entire intent of this was to say, here's the picture that emerges from that, and give you, I hope, a great sense of satisfaction as we both launch the projects and know that while they're complicated, they're in good hands, and to recognize that we're not taking the 4 years to build some of these because we simply couldn't afford that kind of unhoused students for several years, and we don't have to forfeit any quality in the outcome. We will have 4 very, I believe, very independent projects. I think of Evergreen constantly as we think of that community and what the school should look like and how it should operate and how it should feel. But really the same exists for Artendale, and the same will exist because the uniqueness of number 10 and the number 9 where it is. Number 9, we talk about the boundary changes. We've been reaching out for a variety of demographers and getting names of people and firms that can work with us so that we can begin that process as soon as possible and take the anxiety out. At least people know where that boundary is and they can make choices. So excuse me for going into more detail, but I just think I wanted to kind of set for even people watching. The reason for doing this is to set that stage that there won't be a lot of surprises. There will be some wonderful surprises. I see designs emerging and renderings and pictures, but they won't be all of a sudden after some time something happened and nobody understands why it happened. So, Jeff, I may have just caused more questions than I answered, but I think I guess I wanted to share why did we do all of this, and thank you very much for doing that.
Thank you. So that's a big picture in the details, so we really appreciate working with Patrick and working through the details. There's just, you don't need to know the details, there are a lot of details. So there will be projects come forward, and Patrick's the lead on some of the thinking on what we may have to do to Boys and Girls Club to get it ready for next year. In the pre-app we have, we're going to be trying to make sure that we understand whether we can do some things, but we definitely have to make some improvements to that site to accommodate the uses we anticipate next year. So it's a huge pleasure to work with Patrick, and of course Jesse. He's your, whatever it is, graduate of your program, and my partner.
And your partner.
And my partner.
Yeah, whatever you have.
And he's the one who actually has to go through the 150 items in the line item CPM every night to tell me what I'm supposed to do the next day, so I usually appreciate that.
Jeff, and I'm sure the board does, greatly appreciate this kind of 10,000-foot level of looking at this, and I'm sure there's many, many, many details in this. Having said that, this is still pretty detailed for the common person, so a D process, a SEPA, and all that. Well, we need to know that, and we need to know when we're going to be engaged. What thought has been put into, and I don't know if it's you or the district or what, to help set expectations for our community? So if I'm a student potentially or I'm an Evergreen student, and so I learned something tonight that while my school is going to be opened in the fall, I'm not going to still have a playground, it sounds like, until much later because they've got to take down Evergreen and rebuild a playground. So I'm thinking, like, when can we and how do we best communicate this to our community so if we set expectations, people are going to feel better about the process? Those kind of expectations.
So in the 2 months since the bond issue, or a month and a half since the bond issue, whatever it's been, I mean, you haven't seen a lot. There's been a lot of activity to generate a huge amount of information that provides a structure in which we can feel successful in moving forward. So we have a high degree of confidence that the parameters that we set for the project in scope and budget are sound. And the schedule, we won't have as much confidence until we get through the initial meetings with the jurisdictions. But we're just at the point. So today was our first meeting with the architects. And tonight, or maybe tomorrow morning, relatively early, is the first time we'll actually have a final draft of the contract we intend to sign with the architects so that we can share that with the architects. So we're at the inflection point where community engagement and communication will rise up, and I think over the next several weeks you'll see a pattern of engagement and communication that will communicate to the public, both school-specific and district-wide, what the intent is moving forward. So we've talked about it. We'll be implementing a communication plan, and we'll start providing documentation to the district of what we think are the significant milestones for the public to expect in the near term. The architects together with our staff and with Patrick, will be working with each of the two schools that have communities to communicate to both their staff and students and their communities what is intended at that school, at that facility. And so that'll be ongoing from then. So we'll lay out the schedule as we intend it. And then there'll be periodic meetings with that community, updating them with the progress as it moves forward. So initially, we'll be soliciting their ideas about their advice about the elements or how they should go, not what the elements are, the district will set the elements more or less, but how they should be applied to their particular situation. But we'll keep them informed both through district communication and through site-based communication about the status of their project and when different activities are expected.
Okay.
So we start with a big picture of, oh, you're not going to have a playground. The truth of the matter is you're always going to have a playground. So we won't leave a facility with no playground for a year. I just can't tell you for sure what it's going to look like until we work out with the staff exactly how that's going to work. So each site will have a little bit different characteristic in what its playground. I polled my grandson this morning about what he felt about everything, and he said he didn't care so much about the classrooms, but he wanted lots of playground equipment. So that's where my focus was at the moment.
I'm glad to hear that that is being looked at. What I would really like to understand, and you don't have to articulate it tonight, but what does that look like? So if I'm a community member, where do I go look for that information? Or where is it being pushed out, and how is it being pushed out? That's something, as a district, we struggle with, so hopefully, not that you're trying to solve that for us, but at least people know where to go. If I want to look at what's happening at School 9, where's the best place I go look?
So I can't tell you exactly what we're going to do.
Then that's what I said, you don't need to answer that.
But I
today.
can
just
tell
wanted
you,
that.
so from our experience, moving in is a huge deal to us. So we plan moving in months before it occurs. Exactly how we orient every staff member, how do we communicate to all of the children, how do we communicate to all of the parents, so that on day one, people have an expectation of where they're going to go and what it's going to look like. In fact, prior to day one, whenever you post class assignments and everybody comes, we want people to actually see how it's going to function. And we often take all of our staff out to a school site on day 1, 2, and 3 to assist the principal in communicating to the community exactly what the route is. So pretty soon people get the picture exactly what the new configuration is. But there's a lot of communication involved because you have a big population to communicate with. There's a lot of communication involved in every time we go through a phase shift to making sure that everybody's comfortable with the phase shift and what the new configuration is and that it runs smoothly. And so we spend a lot of time on that to make sure that those are smooth. It's just in the plan we gave you today, occupancy was just a gray bar. It says occupancy, as if it's simple, but it's actually a very complicated process.
I would just join in also in trying to answer that question, that the district really owns the bulk of the obligation to have a very fine communication plan in multiple ways that this streaming of the meeting so that people can even watch these conversations and presentations in the monthly reports. The accessing those if they don't happen to be in this time frame, to be able to access them otherwise, to have our online and on website things that people can check in and see what the weekly status is. We're set it up, and we're still working out the details to make sure that what we publish is absolutely accurate. We know that people will fill in the blanks many times, and the rumors get ahead of us, and somebody drives by a building, and the next thing we know is there's a report on it. So we'll try to have that literally weekly and bi-weekly and stay current, So that whether it's an online, whether it's social media, whether it is the website, whether it is the streaming, or whether it's just the ability and to see the project and have pictures posted so that people can see the progress and the wonderful technology that can show a time sequence over the last month of progress made. All of that is happening, I think, with the realization and awareness that our community is very interested. It's special, they've supported it, we've launched, and now we need to keep them informed. So that's really a commitment on my part and the agreement with our project managers that we will have that flow of information, and that is part of the plan. I'll get you definitely more detail on that, but that commitment has to be there, that we keep everybody informed. Because with projects moving as fast as these, you're hearing going to bid in November on one of the projects. That's fast. And if somebody is gone for a few months and comes back, they're going to want to be able to see what's happening rather than just be surprised by it. So that's both the commitment and the partnership that we can get accurate information to people. What they do with it from there may still be a challenge, but I think it's mostly out of the tremendous excitement in the community.
Well, I think if the communication is proactive and we put out the right information, it's consistent, people will have a tendency to not fill in the blanks as much. So hopefully we position it like that. Anyway.
Easy to say.
It's easy to say, yes.
Hard to do.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Over, John.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Go back to our book.
You actually don't need a book.
Will we be filling this up more, or is this, we'll figure that out later.
Yes, but I don't know. I'm
But,
going to
yeah,
leave that.
I'll
to
just, leave that.
those who
Okay.
accumulate.
Cocktail.
Excellent, thank you. So then we will then move on to the programming of our school, 7.2, the School of Choice. And would you
Very,
lead us in that discussion?
very quick, in the last several meetings, we put together and you approved the plan for what happens in the fall of 2019 in terms of our overcrowding, the use of the Boys and Girls Club in this fall of 2019. You approved the 2020 date, the target date for school number 10 to open. Then we separated intentionally at that point for, I think, good reason, the question of the school of choice. And it didn't leave it behind, but we did slow down that piece because we could ask you for approval of the timeline for number 10 and then fill in the blanks on what happens with that school. So I've asked John Helwick to briefly review with you the timeline that we've followed so far on the school of choice, the information that we'll try to put in front of you on the 11th and answer any questions that you have. And then the suggestion would be that we would come to you with a recommendation on the April 25th board meeting for whether or not to proceed with a school of choice and what that choice would be. So first, I'd like to ask John to recap what we've done and the timeline we've followed.
Leslie does not have this.
Leslie, there's a piece of paper that's being circulated by John Helwick, and we'll try to make sure that we verbally highlight that.
Does that cause a problem if we do that?
You can scan it and email it to me.
Yes.
I'll leave that in Brooke's hands. She's going to do that.
We're going to move on, right?
Okay. So, before we get to the timeline on here, I'll review what we've done with the School of Choice. So, we sent out a survey prior to the bond. So, it was right after the bond had passed, but prior to the next board meeting following that, to gather feedback about possible theme options. And we had 3 options on there, and we also had place for comment. We had 400 comments on that survey. And the 3 options that were posted were the STEAM, the community, and the School of Arts. And that closed when we got to the board meeting where we were going to take the step back from that theme school. And we haven't asked for additional theme ideas since then. But we do have that information, we have those responses, and so that was just kind of on hold since then. So now we can go to this and talk about the timeline going forward. So the posting for the principal position went up on Tuesday, I believe, which is the 2nd. And so that's been posted on all the state websites, and that closes on the 17th. We're going to do screening, that's the week of spring break. We'll do screening that week to get down to 5 or so candidates to interview on Monday, the April 22nd. And then sometime between Monday, April 22nd and the board meeting, we're still working on the exact time, but we will have a final interview and then a recommendation at the board meeting. And also at the board meeting, at that point, we think we would have a decision on whether it's choice or not choice or a neighborhood school. Either way, the naming process would begin at that point. And if the board does choose the approval of school of choice, then we would take whatever steps the board directs on either gathering more information or going forward with a theme, whatever the board wants to go with that. So all the other notes on there are the timeline for the naming process. So we've gotten 4 community member names. I've been in contact with those members, and we're trying to figure out the times for the weeks where we'll be bringing them in. And we'll have a pretty wide group there that I think we've shared with you. So right after that board meeting, we'd get all of that naming committee protocol stuff up on the website so people would know what the process looks like. And then we do promotion in the buildings to start generating some theme ideas, gathering all of that, bringing that to the naming committee, reducing the number down, then going back out with that reduced number to get more feedback, and then bringing it back to the selection committee again to get it narrowed down even further, with the goal at the June 13th board study session of having the 3 to 5 recommended names to bring to you.
John, you said theme in there, not theme of the school, but theme of the naming?
Sorry, I meant name
Okay.
for the building, yeah. So everything from April 29th on that timeline has to do with just for the
Okay,
naming
the
process.
naming process.
As far as the theme selection goes, again, we'll take your direction on whether we've gathered enough feedback or if we want to go out for more feedback.
So the naming committee won't start meeting until 2nd week of May? Just
Correct. We would start the process right after the principal's hired, because we wanted the principal to be involved in that, but we'd actually just start generating lots of names from our community and then bring the committee together on the week of May 13th for the first time.
But both of those meetings will be in May.
Correct, the May 13th and the week of May 28th. So they would come together twice during May.
So I'm
It could
just
meet
want to
more than that if necessary, but
Sure.
probably not.
Yeah, we can definitely.
Yeah.
So next week, the meeting on April 11th, we would bring to you the backup to, these are the results from the theming, the number of people that indicated an interest in this STEM or STEAM, the number of people that saw the community option as a better theme, or the arts option as, and trying to both approach the fact that there really are 2 separate decisions there. One decision is, do you want to go with a school of choice? And secondly, as what those choices might be, practically speaking. A quick reminder, and this will be just a precursor to a comment that we'll make next week, is that those 3 themes were selected because in essence, they were most doable in terms of our initial staffing of the school and also high interest and doable. So making up, but not being really facetious, if we chose to do a school of Chinese language immersion, we have no staff member. We have one staff member who could help us, but we would not really be able to do that in the same time frame. So one of those questions really has to do with the school, revisiting the reasons behind recommending a school of choice, the alternatives to that, try to answer some of the questions that the board had posed about how would the transportation work, what would a lottery look like, how would that affect, would it include siblings if somebody was chosen or not chosen, how many students would be in that school that first year, et cetera, et cetera. Try to answer as many of those next week as possible. At the same time, gather from you tonight anything else you would, in particular, would like to at least hopefully have answered next week. Give you enough information next week that 2 weeks later, both you and the public would know what we're looking at for selection on the 25th. And if that's approved, when it's approved, we would move ahead then to implement and educate and share as broadly as possible. So the rest of that really falls into what we already know we'll try to get to you next week. Well, if you have questions you want to arm us with tonight or tomorrow, as quickly as possible so that we can try to gather that information for next Thursday. And put as many knowns on the table for Thursday the 11th that would lead that question on the 25th and not have too many surprises for people.
Just a clarification, whether we go with the school of choice or not, that would really truly be in effect in the fall of 2020?
Correct.
So next year is a transition year and taking care of overflow.
Yeah, that we shelved that, I guess, original idea that we would phase in School 10 and start something in the fall of 19. So that's completely null and void. We've chosen to use that facility otherwise to serve our immediate overcrowding, and the fall of 2020 would be completion, as you saw from Mr. Green. We'll have the addition complete. We'll have school number 10 open that fall, and the kids and the staff will know who's going to be there, and that will all happen in the fall of 20. So nothing in the fall of 19.
And we're going to be doing a walk through the building with Discovery 5th grade teachers tomorrow morning. Lisa Ray did a walkthrough with the Purdy Preschool earlier this week. So all of the teachers that are going to be housed there next year will have by tomorrow gone in and looked at the site, and so they know what we're working with, and we'll continue to work with them on getting those classrooms ready to go. Also wanted to note that I did put a frequently asked questions that I did think I shared with you. It's on the website, and it's on all of the elementary school websites. It's on the PSD elementary website, and so there's a chance for parents to get some more information about if they've never heard of a choice school, what does that mean? So just to try and get that information out.
One other update that you may not have heard, because I haven't really shared it publicly, was when we were looking at opening in the fall of 19, we were talking about opening a school that was K through 3 and about 160 kids, and that came out of having 8 classrooms that we would use. So that 2 kindergartens, 2 first grades, 2 second, 2 thirds, and that generated 160 students. That still has a life out there that's floating around. I noticed the newspaper just opened our school with 30 classrooms and 160 students.
This fall?
That would have the best ratio in the state
5
of
kids per
Washington.
classroom. Awesome.
We would probably get lots of recruits if we averaged 5 students per class, but really the capacity of that school is 550 students. Technically, it goes to 600, but we would not try to fill it at 600 the first time the doors open. The other thing that's related to that is that looking at opening with 160 in the fall of 19, we were looking at restricting that where any lottery that took place would just be for a child and not for the siblings. That came up for a fair number of questions and family decisions. So I wanted to clarify that when we open with a full-blown school in the fall of 2020, we would be able to open with that lottery being including siblings. So it eases some of the family pressures and decisions. I've emphasized to some people I've talked to that had that been my 3 children, they would have, the one that would have been in the art school and the classical pianist, and I had the other one that was math and science all the way, and they would have separated at that point, not necessarily all been wanting to do that. But I do clarify that because both the 160 that got publicized is not accurate, and the issue of whether siblings could be chosen is not accurate anymore because we're in a different place in the fall of 2020. So just add a couple elements.
So the fall of 2020 is going to be K through 5
Correct.
Yes.
with a full-sized elementary as
And if it's
defined
a-
by Peninsula School District.
And if it's a school
Got
of
it.
choice, and it's a lottery, and I don't have kids in school, but my 4th grader gets picked in the lottery, then my other 3 kids all get to go there because my 4th grader got picked. So, because I would disagree with that.
We would open.
Totally disagree.
We could open that as a possibility, and there again, you would have families that would say they would like that option. You would have families that would say, no, I really don't want that option. But it's an option that would be available to you, whereas in that original fall of 19 opening, that would not have been an option. That's an option. So that'll be part of what we talk about on
How
the,
have we decided? We have not decided that yet.
Right.
that'll be part of what we talk about on the 11th.
You brought it up.
I did, but I brought it up intentionally to deal with both 160 and the fact that was a particular question that had come up of would this allow, so in advance of the 11th, there's a topic for you. One of several decisions you're going to get to make regarding this, including whether it should be art or STEAM or community.
John, can I back to your timeline?
Yeah.
I'm curious how you handle interviewing and hiring a principal and making a recommendation for a principal when you don't really know what School 10 is going to be yet.
So we're kind of treating it as a generic school. So we're not seeking a principal for a school of choice. So we're just seeking a strong
Right, but what
leader.
if you get a principal and then we decide it is going to be a school of choice and they don't want that?
They would know that that's a possibility.
Okay.
So here's a hypothetical, I don't mean to cut you off. If the board picked a school of choice and a school and school of choice was an art-focused school, and the principal really had no background in art, would that be an issue for a principal supervising a full staff of art teachers? Or, you know what I mean, not
Yeah,
music,
I think-
art, drama, whatever.
I think, again, our goal is to get all kids to standards no matter which school we're talking about. So it might have more of an art bent than other schools, but if we hire the right person, whether it's art or STEAM or community or whatever the school is, we would hire a leader that could handle any of those situations.
If I can put a little flesh on that.
Leslie?
Hello?
Yes?
Thanks. I can't raise my hand. I guess what I'm wondering is that, Art, if you can collect all the questions that the board has had up to this point and put it in an email to us so we can review and see what we've covered and not covered. I also know that there was a timeline at some point that we were given. I think it was just a month of where the district was going to be doing research on the school of choice. I would like to know where we are with that, and I'd like the information up to, what we have up to this point. and see if that generates any more questions for the board prior to the next meeting.
Leslie, are you talking about questions outside of this meeting or just at this meeting tonight from the board?
Both. We've had, there's been a lot of conversation since pitching and considering a school of choice.
Yep.
And I'm hearing some repetition here, so I'm wondering if we can just sort of gather them all together, the ones that from previous meetings, from this meeting, and see where we're at. But also I want to see where we are, where the district is up to this point in the process. I know that they have met with a superintendent from another district, and that person probably has some really valuable information to share, so I would like to know how they address some of their challenges. I do want to know what's going on with the redistricting, and, you know, there's lots of other things, but I think having it all in one place for us to review and then kind of coordinating our questions accordingly prior to the meeting would be efficient.
Okay.
Work on getting that together.
That is, pardon?
I can work on getting that together and
Yeah, and I think that's the type of information that we were going to receive in preparation and for the April 11th meeting.
Yes.
yes.
That's what
And
I thought the
following
intent.
up on what Leslie said, the, some of the considerations and things that you've learned and/or research that is easily accessed, whatever, in terms of impact on student outcomes and success and sort of pros and cons, anything that's fairly straightforward, simple to read, but looks at that holistically.
Whatever we can get to you in advance so that you have that, and as well as a recap of the questions that we don't have answers for yet, or we'll try to answer on the 11th, and all of that will be coming. We have 2 topics, if not 3, on the night of the 11th. So a study session, this is one part of the study session. I do want to emphasize we also have scheduled the Healthy Youth Survey summary to come to the board that evening, as well as John Yellowlees is presenting that. Basically, it's an annual report on the student services, but it feeds right off the Healthy Youth Survey. Where are we, what are we doing, and what's ahead for us? So those topics will all tie together, but in answer to Leslie's question, and really for all of you, we'll try to gather everything we can gather relative to this, put it in a really a comprehensive report. This is why we started, this is what the rationale was, this is the data or the information, and these are the choices, and here are some of the ways the board can look at that. And the question, for example, of siblings is not intended to be divisive as much as it's an option that you get to look at and say, here's the way we would recommend that it works.
So I think back to your original question, was there anything new or any other information that you'd like, that we would like you to gather? I don't think I heard anything in particularly new, just answering what we've already asked and collect that all together as Leslie mentioned.
The one new thing that I am asking for is, where are we up to this point? Where is the district up to this point in their research with the surveys, talking to staff, addressing the equity issues, all of those things, and also a comprehensive report of the feedback from the superintendent. I'm sorry, I can't remember her name, that I believe John and some other folks spoke to who have already gone through the process, the pitfalls, the pluses, the minuses, all of those things.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think you're referring to Dr. Shannon Harvey. She's an assistant superintendent from a district that just implemented this fall their first school of choice. So
Which district?
that's from Renton.
Okay.
That was a STEM school.
Okay.
Sorry.
So a lot to bring back to us on April 11th on that, in preparation of the,
And we can get it to you in advance of that, so you
Yes,
can have time to
please.
review.
okay, thank you. Okay, anything else on school of choice at this point? Any other questions on school of choice? Leslie, Marcia? Okay.
I'm good, thank you.
Okay. So with that, just before we end, just a shout out to everybody. We've got a lot of nights that we're here. after working long, long days, I'm sure. So thank you to all of you and for bringing this all together for the board. And thank you to the board for meeting so many evenings as well, so. And Brooke for making it all happen. So anyway, this meeting is now adjourned at 7:50.